The train had been moving for 3 full days when Werner Hartmann finally pressed his tired face against the cool glass of the window. He was 20 years old, this German soldier, and he'd been watching an entirely foreign world slide past his eyes ever since the long journey began at Camp Shanks in New York. The landscape of America unfolded before him like pages in a book he'd never been permitted to read, each mile revealing something new, something unexpected, something that contradicted everything he'd been taught to believe. The rhythmic clatter of the rails beneath them had become a kind of meditation, a soundtrack to confusion and wonder. When the train began its slow approach into yet another station, Hartmann felt his breath catch in his throat. The sign read Amarillo, Texas, and on the wooden platform stood a figure that seemed to have stepped directly out of mythology. A man wearing leather chaps and a hat with a brim so wide it cast his entire face in shadow was watching their train pass. He was rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers, squinting against the brilliant desert sun, and he was unmistakably, undeniably real. Not an image from a propaganda poster designed to mock American culture. Not an actor performing in some Hollywood Western film. This was an actual cowboy, existing in the flesh, in the year 1943, as if time had somehow folded in on itself. Hartmann was one among 500 men on that train, all of them German prisoners of war, all of them about to enter a reality that Joseph Goebbels and his entire propaganda apparatus had insisted was nothing more than American fantasy. Most of these men had served in the Afrika Korps. They'd fought in the burning sands under Rommel's command. They'd been captured at places with names like Kasserine Pass, Tunis, and Sicily. These were soldiers who had genuinely expected to die in the desert, though they'd imagined it would be a different desert entirely, with a very different outcome. The machinery of Nazi propaganda had spent years preparing them for what American captivity would mean. They'd been told to expect barbarism of the worst kind. Torture would be routine. The uncultured mongrels of the New World, mixed race and without any true civilization, would treat them worse than animals. After all, Americans were soft people, decadent and weak, a nation of cowboys and gangsters without culture or honor or any real strength. The first contradiction to this carefully constructed narrative had arrived on the transport ships that carried them across the Atlantic. Instead of starvation rations or contaminated water, they'd been given white bread. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute they'd grown accustomed to in the Wehrmacht. 3 hot meals every single day. More food, in fact, than German soldiers had seen in months of active service. These were the same rations that American soldiers received, provided to prisoners as required by the Geneva Convention. It was a requirement that the Americans, surprisingly, actually followed. Now, as the train carried them deeper into the heart of Texas, the contradictions and impossibilities seemed to multiply with each passing mile. Through those windows, they could see farmland that stretched beyond the horizon, fields so vast they seemed to have no ending. Herds of cattle numbered in the thousands, spread across prairies that went on forever. The sheer scale of American agriculture was something none of them had been prepared to witness. The Americans, it seemed, had so much of everything that they could afford to share it even with their enemies, men who had been trying to kill their soldiers just weeks or months before. Camp Hearn sat 30 miles northwest of Houston, constructed originally to house 4,800 prisoners. In reality, it resembled nothing so much as a small American town that had been dropped into the middle of cotton country. When the buses from the train station finally drove through the main gate, the Germans aboard them expected to see machine gun towers bristling with weapons, attack dogs straining at their leashes, brutal guards ready to exact revenge for every American death. Instead, what greeted them were rows of barracks equipped with electricity and indoor plumbing, facilities for hot showers, flush toilets, amenities that many of these men had never had access to in their entire lives, not even back home in Germany. The camp commander stood before them that first day, speaking through a translator, and laid out rules that seemed almost impossibly generous. The requirements were straightforward enough. Work for 8 hours each day, follow the camp regulations, cause no trouble. In exchange for this, they would receive 3 substantial meals daily, wages amounting to 80 cents per day paid in camp scrip, privileges at the canteen, opportunities for recreation, and most incredibly, the ability to send and receive mail from home. Unteroffizier Friedrich Becker stood in that assembly, unable to fully process what his ears were telling him. Wages? The Americans were going to pay them? The same rate, he learned, that American privates earned, roughly $50 per month. These were prisoners of war, defeated enemies, yet they would be compensated for their labor as if they were valued workers. The next morning brought another shock to their system. They met their work supervisors and discovered that these weren't soldiers at all. They were ranchers, cotton farmers, cattlemen, men dressed in worn denim and leather boots, their hands calloused from years of hard labor. These were men who desperately needed workers for the harvest season. The American agricultural system was feeding not just America, but half the free world beyond it, and every able-bodied American man was either already in uniform or about to be, fighting in Italy or preparing for the invasion of France that everyone knew was coming. The cotton fields of Texas stretched for thousands upon thousands of acres, and without workers to bring in the harvest, all of that cotton would simply rot where it stood. The German prisoners represented the answer to every farmer's most desperate prayer. A rancher named John Davidson surveyed the group of prisoners assembled before him that morning. He needed 40 men for his cotton operation. He walked among them, pointing at the biggest, the strongest, the most capable-looking Germans. Then he did something that brought everything to a complete standstill. He walked directly over to the nearest prisoner, extended his hand, and introduced himself by name. In Texas, he explained through the camp translator, men shake hands before they work together. It was a matter of basic respect. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Müller found himself staring at that extended hand as if it were some kind of weapon he didn't recognize. 6 months earlier, he had been engaged in active combat against American forces in Tunisia, firing his weapon with the full intention of killing as many of them as possible. Now, one of these Americans wanted to shake his hand like an equal, like a fellow human being. After a moment of hesitation, Müller took the offered hand. Davidson's grip was firm and his palm was calloused, the unmistakable hand of a man who worked for his living. The cotton fields of Brazos County stretched outward for miles in every direction. Under the relentless Texas sun, the work proved to be genuinely brutal. Backs bent for hours at a time, fingers bleeding from the sharp edges of cotton bolls, 100-pound sacks that had to be dragged and lifted and carried. But something extraordinary began to happen in those fields, something that would have been impossible anywhere else in the world at that moment in history. The German prisoners found themselves working alongside Mexican migrant workers. They worked beside black sharecroppers. They worked next to poor white tenant farmers. The elaborate racial hierarchy that Nazi ideology had preached as fundamental truth began to crumble under that Texas sun. Everyone's sweat looked the same. Everyone's back ached in identical ways. Everyone drank from the same water bucket when it was passed around. When noon arrived each day, a woman named Rosa Martinez would ring the dinner bell. She was the ranch cook, and the prisoners had naturally expected to receive bread and water, maybe thin soup if they were fortunate. Instead, she served them beef stew, cornbread still warm from the oven, sweet tea, and apple pie. Rosa didn't speak a word of German. The prisoners didn't speak Spanish. But she would ladle extra portions onto their plates and smile at them, and food proved to be a language that required no translation. Werner Hartmann would remember that meal for the rest of his life, and it wasn't because of how the food tasted, though it was delicious. He would remember it because a Mexican woman treated German prisoners with exactly the same kindness she showed to everyone else who came to her table. The Third Reich had insisted that such a thing was impossible. The Third Reich had been wrong. Saturday nights at Camp Herne, the recreation hall would fill with music, not military marches, not Nazi anthems. The prisoners had formed bands, and they played American jazz, songs they'd heard on the radio, melodies they'd learned from the guards. Some of them had brought instruments from Germany or had been provided with new ones by the Americans. The music drifted out across the Texas prairie, and it sounded like hope, or perhaps like the future. In his cramped handwriting, Werner Hartmann composed a letter to his mother back in Hamburg. "The Americans are not what we were told," he wrote carefully, knowing that censors would read every word. "They have given us warm clothes and good boots. We eat meat every day. I am saving my wages. When I come home, we will have money." He didn't mention the abundance that surrounded him on every side. He didn't write about how every farmer seemed to own an automobile, or how electric lights burned all night long, or how the stores in nearby towns were packed with goods of every description. How could he possibly explain such things? She would never believe him, and besides, the censors would probably strike it all out anyway. At Camp McLean, situated near Amarillo, the Cowboys were not metaphorical or symbolic. They were absolutely real, and they desperately needed help managing thousands of head of cattle. The rancher, a man named Thomas Anderson, looked over his new workforce with a mixture of hope and concern. He saw Luftwaffe pilots who'd flown combat missions over Britain. He saw Panzer crewmen who'd fought in tank battles. He saw U-boat sailors who'd hunted Allied shipping. Not a single one of them had ever been within touching distance of a cow. Anderson sighed deeply. This, he thought, was going to be extremely interesting. He began with the absolute basics: how to approach a horse without startling it, how to hold a rope properly, how to avoid getting kicked, bitten, or trampled. The Germans were genuinely terrified of these large animals. The animals, for their part, were deeply suspicious of these awkward Germans. It was mutual distrust at first sight, a standoff between species and between enemies. But Thomas Anderson was a patient man. His own son was somewhere over Germany at that very moment, flying B-17 bombing missions, dropping destruction on German cities. These boys standing before him in their prisoner uniforms were somebody's sons too. They were the enemy, yes, but they were here now, and cattle didn't care about politics or national allegiances. Within a few weeks, something almost magical began to occur. The Germans took to ranching as if they'd been born specifically for this purpose. Perhaps it was their military discipline translating well to the structured work. Perhaps it was their engineering minds appreciating the complex logistics involved in moving large herds. Perhaps it was simply that working with animals was honest in a way that war had never been. Hauptmann Erich Schmidt, who had commanded men in battle, became Anderson's finest horseman. He could rope with accuracy, brand cattle without hesitation, and doctor sick animals with the skill of someone who'd been doing it his entire life. At night, he would sit with a sketch pad and draw the landscape around him, mesas at sunset, longhorns silhouetted against enormous skies, Cowboys and Germans working side by side. These were images that would have been impossible anywhere else in the world in the year 1943, yet here they were, real and documented. Sunday mornings within the camps brought something else unexpected. German prisoners held their own religious services. Lutheran ministers and Catholic priests who happened to be among the prisoners of war would lead worship. The American military provided hymnals, religious materials, complete freedom of religion, even for their enemies. Some camps would arrange special permits allowing prisoners to attend local churches on important holidays. Christmas of 1944 found a handful of German prisoners of war sitting in the back pews of a small American church. The congregation was singing Silent Night, which of course had originated as Stille Nacht in German. These prisoners knew every single word, had sung it since childhood. By the time the third verse arrived, some of them were crying openly. Not from sadness or homesickness, though those emotions were certainly present. They were crying from the profound shock of being treated as human beings in an enemy land, of being welcomed into a sacred space, of being reminded that they were more than just prisoners, more than just the enemy. On December 23, 1944, at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, 25 U-boat sailors completed a tunnel they'd been digging in secret for 3 months. The tunnel stretched 178 feet beyond the camp fence. That night, they escaped according to their carefully constructed plan. The strategy was brilliant in its conception, but catastrophically stupid in its assumptions. They intended to float down the Salt River all the way to Mexico, then live as free men until Germany won the war, which they still believed was possible. They'd built a collapsible boat. They'd studied maps. They'd saved food. Everything was ready. Kapitänleutnant Hans-Werner Krauss led the way. They emerged from the tunnel into the Arizona desert under a full moon, tasting freedom for the first time in months. They ran toward where the river should be, and then they stopped. The Salt River was completely dry, not a single drop of water, just sand and rocks stretching out under the moonlight. The maps they'd been using were from 1880, created before the dams were built, before irrigation projects diverted the water. Their boat was useless. Their entire plan was dead. They scattered into the desert in small groups. Within hours, most of them were hopelessly lost. The Arizona desert is unforgiving in December. Freezing cold at night, burning hot during the day. They had no water, no real food, no idea where they were or how to survive. Unteroffizier Johann Kramer stumbled into a gas station near Phoenix after 3 days of freedom. He was severely sunburned, dangerously dehydrated, hallucinating from exposure. The station attendant, an old man named Pete, immediately gave him water, made him a sandwich. Then, while they waited for the authorities to arrive, Pete shared his coffee and told Kramer about his own son fighting in the Pacific. 2 fathers' sons, one lost in the desert, one lost in a war that seemed to have no end. Kapitän Jürgen Wottenberg managed to make it the furthest of any escapee. He made it all the way to downtown Phoenix, where he spent several days trying to blend in. On January 28th, he was sitting on Van Buren Street when a street cleaner noticed his accent and became suspicious. The police found him exhausted, homesick, and ready to return to captivity. Even escaped and free, even in the middle of nowhere, America was still America. Abundant, comfortable, and somehow impossible to hate. Spring of 1945 brought a shift in mood throughout all the camps. The war in Europe was clearly ending. Letters from home stopped arriving with any regularity. The letters that did arrive brought news of cities reduced to rubble, families scattered or dead. What was there to return to? What home still existed? Thomas Anderson made an offer to his German Cowboys one evening. He told them honestly that he wished they could stay, work the ranch permanently. He would sponsor them if the law permitted. The pay would be good, better than they'd make anywhere in Germany, if Germany even existed anymore as a functioning nation. $100 a month plus room and board. But the Geneva Convention was absolutely clear on this point. All prisoners must be repatriated without exception. They had to go home. But home to what? Soviet occupation? Mountains of rubble? Starvation? Ranchers across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona began writing letters to their congressmen. These weren't just prisoners anymore, they argued. These men were neighbors, friends, the best and hardest workers they'd ever employed. But the law was the law, unchangeable and absolute. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. In Camp Herne, the prisoners gathered around the radio and listened in complete silence. Their country was gone. The Third Reich that Hitler had promised would last for 1,000 years had lasted just 12. Everything they'd fought for had been reduced to ash. But something else had been born during their captivity. In these camps, on these ranches, in these churches, understanding had taken root, friendship had grown. A different future than anyone could have imagined was becoming possible. That night, John Davidson brought a bottle of good bourbon to the camp, pre-war whiskey that he'd been saving. He shared it with Wilhelm Müller and the other Germans who had worked his fields for so many months. They drank to the end of the war. They drank to the dead on all sides. They drank to whatever might come next. Müller told him, in English that no longer required an interpreter, that he wanted to come back someday, when it was legal, if it was permitted. America had shown him something that Germany never had. That strength doesn't require cruelty. That power doesn't demand hatred. That enemies can become friends over cotton fields and cattle drives. The repatriation process began in 1946. The trains reversed their long journey, heading east to the ports. Ships carried them back to Europe, back to a destroyed nation that barely resembled the one they'd left. But these Germans carried something with them that was more valuable than any material possession. They carried knowledge, not military secrets or strategic information, something far more powerful. They knew how Americans farmed, how they organized their operations, how they worked efficiently. They'd witnessed American abundance firsthand and understood that it wasn't magic or luck. It was methods, machinery, management, systems that could be learned, copied, and adapted to any situation. More importantly than any technical knowledge, they knew Americans as people, not the propaganda caricatures they'd been fed for years, real Americans. Thomas Anderson patiently teaching them to ride horses, Rosa Martinez ladling extra stew onto their plates with a smile, John Davidson shaking their hands like equals, Pete giving water to an escaped prisoner who could have been shot. When they told these stories back in Germany, no one believed them at first. Americans treating prisoners better than Germany had treated its own soldiers? Impossible. Paying them wages, teaching them valuable skills, welcoming them into churches? Pure fantasy. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. 425,000 German prisoners of war had worked on American farms between 1943 and 1946. They had harvested millions of dollars worth of crops. They'd picked cotton by the ton. They'd saved entire harvests that would have otherwise rotted in the fields. The American agricultural miracle that had fed the Allied war effort, German prisoners had helped make it possible. By 1950, something remarkable began to happen. Immigration laws changed. Former prisoners of war could return to America legally if they chose. They boarded ships in Hamburg and Bremen, not as prisoners this time, but as immigrants, willingly seeking the America they'd discovered during their captivity. Werner Hartmann, the former Africa Corps sergeant, returned to Texas in 1951. John Davidson was waiting for him at the station. The same handshake. A stronger grip, perhaps. No translator needed any more. His English was perfect by then, with a Texas accent so thick you'd never guess he was born in Germany. He sounded exactly like a cowboy. He married a local girl within a year, opened a machine shop in town, built a good business fixing tractors and farm equipment. His son would go on to attend Texas A&M University and study agriculture. His grandson would serve in Afghanistan with the United States Army, 82nd Airborne Division. The transformation from enemy to American was complete across 3 generations. Another former prisoner returned to Arizona and found Thomas Anderson had work waiting for him. The best horseman he'd ever trained, Anderson said. Eventually, this man saved enough money to buy his own ranch, 500 acres near Tucson. He raised quarter horses that won prizes at state fairs across the Southwest. His neighbors all knew his story, knew where he'd come from. They didn't care. In Arizona, people judge you by how well you work, not where you were born. Even one of the Papago Park escapees returned legally years later. He opened a small business in Phoenix, not terribly far from where he'd been recaptured after his failed escape attempt. The irony of this wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story. Decades later, when most of them were old men, former prisoners of war began returning to visit the camps where they'd been held. They brought photo albums filled with images. Young men in Wehrmacht uniforms learning to pick cotton, learning to rope cattle, learning that their enemies were human beings just like them. At one reunion gathering, an elderly rancher stood to speak. His voice was weaker than it had been in his youth, but his message rang out clear. "You boys came here as enemies," he said. "You left as friends. You came back as family. That's the American way. That's the cowboy way. That's the human way." The applause went on for 5 full minutes. Former enemies embraced each other. There wasn't a dry eye anywhere in the room. The numbers tell one version of this story. 425,000 German prisoners of war. 700 camps spread across 46 states. Millions of dollars in agricultural labor performed. 5,000 eventually returning as immigrants. But the real story, the one that matters, isn't contained in any statistics. It's in the transformations that occurred. Nazi soldiers becoming Texas cowboys. Enemies becoming neighbors and then friends. Hatred dissolved by simple hospitality. Propaganda shattered by uncomplicated human kindness. The Germans had expected American barbarism based on everything they'd been told. Instead, they found American abundance. Not just material abundance, though there was plenty of that. They found an abundance of spirit. They encountered the confidence of a nation so secure in itself that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies, so strong that it could show mercy without appearing weak. In his final letter from Camp McLean before repatriation, one prisoner of war wrote these words to his mother. "The Americans are cowboys, just like Goebbels said they were. But he never told us that cowboys could be kind. He never told us they would share their food, their skills, their humanity with us. He never told us they would teach us to ride horses and repair tractors and treat us like human beings. He never told us they would shake our hands and look us in the eye. He never told us the truth about anything. The truth, as it turned out, was both simpler and more profound than any propaganda could capture." In the American West, in those camps scattered across Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, German prisoners of war discovered something that transcended nationality, ideology, and war itself. They discovered that enemies are often just strangers you haven't worked beside yet, that hatred cannot survive a harvest season, that shared labor creates bonds stronger than any political division, that humanity is more powerful than any uniform or any flag. They had arrived as warriors of the Third Reich, convinced of their superiority, indoctrinated in hatred, prepared for brutality. They left as cowboys, changed men who understood something fundamental about the world. In the dust of Texas cotton fields, in the mesa shadows of New Mexico, under the desert sun of Arizona, they learned what was perhaps the most dangerous lesson possible for any totalitarian ideology. They learned that their enemies were human beings, and that they were human beings too. They learned that the propaganda had been lies, all of it from beginning to end. They learned that kindness is stronger than cruelty, that generosity is more powerful than hatred, that the simple act of treating people with dignity can change the world in ways that no weapon ever could.